In just 10 years, we've seen one of the fastest social changes in American history. Among young people calling themselves transgender, it exploded from barely measurable numbers to 3%, with another 2% who aren't sure. That's millions of young people. But this isn't just about numbers. It's about how a movement gained unprecedented power quickly. It reshaped America, from medical practice to language, even how society views basic concepts like gender. The elephant in the room is how this movement gained so much power so quickly, and why it's now heading downhill. I'm Ken LaCorte. I dig into uncomfortable topics and give you as fair and straightforward answers as I can, especially when they challenge the mainstream narrative. In the next few minutes, we'll look at the movement's dramatic rise, especially among females, how a perfect storm of forces created that rise, and how activists went too far and why 2024 became its turning point. Historically, transgenders were a tiny fraction of the population. In fact, before 2010, most medical literature estimated that gender dysphoria affected about 1 in 10,000 biological males, and even fewer females. These numbers held steady for decades, and medical and psychological transitions were viewed as last resorts. Then, the numbers just exploded. But it wasn't just those numbers that changed. It was the very nature of who identified as transgender. Historically, the vast majority of transgenders were biological males going to female, and now that pattern has completely reversed. There are more women seeking to become men, and among teens, biological females dominate the numbers. This isn't just in America. Similar patterns emerged across the entire Western world, especially in countries with strong social media usage. Sweden saw 1,500% in teen girls trying to get medical treatments for transgenderism. And in the UK, referrals to gender clinics rose 4,400% over a decade. A fundamental debate is why. Were these transgenders always there but finally free to be themselves? Or was there something else going on driving this growth? This transformation, especially among young people, it didn't happen by accident. It was a perfect storm of forces that came together. It started with the success of the gay rights movement. After winning the battle for marriage and legal equality, many of these same activists and organizations shifted their focus to transgender rights. And with them, they brought proven tactics and an infrastructure for social change. It also coincided with the anti-bullying movement in America. When I was in school in the 70s and 80s, it was all about don't do drugs. In my children's years, it was all about fighting bullies and being tolerant to all. First up was the battle over words, because winning the language war was crucial. All activists understand that. They know that by controlling the conversation, they can control the debate itself. The transgender world successfully shifted the conversation by redefining words like men and women to center on gender identity, not biological sex. Even basic language was rewritten, with terms like ladies and gentlemen being called exclusionary and being swapped out. They replaced clinical-sounding terms like sex change with gender-affirming healthcare, obscuring the medical reality of surgeries and hormone treatments. I mean, think about it. What kind of a decent person would be against gender-affirming care? It sounds great. And the most important factor in reaching young people was the ultimate tool, social media. The information flow to kids wasn't just parents, teachers, and friends anymore. Social media algorithms created powerful echo chambers which amplified transgender messaging to kids. Studies show that about half of transgenders cited YouTube videos as influential in their decisions. For young people questioning their identity, these digital spaces became powerful influence centers. The social dynamic was especially important among teenage girls and their friendship groups. They place high value on social cohesion and fear rejection, making them particularly susceptible to what experts call social contagion effects. When one member of a friend group identified as trans, often others followed. Some clinics reported entire friend groups showing up for treatment. Then, as the movement gained power, institutions fell in line one after another. Schools adopted new policies, often keeping parents in the dark. Medical associations rewrote their guidelines, making it easier for young people to start treatments and surgery. Corporations rushed to cash in on things, as they always do. I mean, even Donald Trump, running in 2016, when pressed, said transgender people should be able to use whatever bathroom they feel is appropriate, and he had no interest in turning it into a campaign issue. And the movement's demands grew larger. It wasn't enough to accept transgender individuals. You had to fully embrace their ideology or be branded transphobic. The notion that biological sex itself was a social construct became mainstream in many circles. The phrase trans women are women became an unquestionable mantra. This created a growing divide between activists and medical professionals. Many doctors and researchers had concerns as transition became less about treating gender dysphoria and more about affirming any claim of gender identity. But it was becoming harder to resist. Two competing narratives emerged. Activists insisted these transgender youth were always there. They were just finally free to be themselves. Critics, pointing to the unprecedented speed of the change and the complete reversal in gender ratios, they saw evidence of a social contagion. But that perfect storm had gathered strong, and the movement seemed unstoppable. But as history shows time and time again, rapid gains in political power often lead to overreach. And that's exactly what happened next. Hey, real quick, if I make any substantive mistake in this video, let me know and I'll address it in a pinned comment below. Okay, so when a movement gains power quickly, overreach almost always follows. What started as a push for basic rights and dignity morphed into something more extreme, and the pushback was going to be inevitable. Here's where the movement began to erode public support and turn allies into skeptics. The first was their use of censorship. What began as respect turned into forced compliance. It was less about acceptance and more about enforcement. Dissent wasn't just discouraged, it was silenced. Criticism of any kind, even mild or well-meaning, it became transphobia, and those who voiced it got slammed. Social media platforms became ground zero. As the transgender movement gained traction, those platforms implemented policies aimed at curbing what they called hate speech, or misgendering, or dead-naming. In practice, this meant punishing users for sometimes stating basic biological facts or expressing concerns about the movement's excesses. Women were banned from Twitter for referring to biological males as a he. Academics who questioned gender identity lost positions. Even comedians found their jokes subject to the language police. Take Megan Murphy, a Canadian feminist banned from Twitter for tweeting, "Men aren't women." Her account was permanently suspended, at least until Elon came along, in a legal battle that set precedent for silencing even factual, biologically grounded statements. Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, who criticized gender ideology while affirming trans rights, became the target of widespread boycotts, death threats, and being labeled a bigot. These weren't just fringe cases, they reflected the movement's broader intolerance for dissent. And censorship went beyond individuals. Social media algorithms began suppressing certain content, making sure that alternative viewpoints wouldn't reach a broader audience. Platforms like YouTube demonetize creators who discuss transitioners or raise concerns about medical intervention on minors. Reddit banned entire communities. Academia and medicine weren't immune either. Researchers who cautioned against fast-tracking transitions for minors faced career-ending repercussions. Dr. Lisa Lippman, who published a study on rapid-onset gender dysphoria, a phenomenon suggesting social contagion among teens, was vilified and her work discredited by activists despite being grounded in some solid empirical research. The mass media played its role too. By presenting one-sided narratives, outlets often framed any opposition as bigotry. Critics weren't debating, they were portrayed as enemies of progress. The result was an environment where one side of the debate could dominate unchecked, and they dominated. And it also made genuine concerns taboo to say. And the two biggest concerns people had were related to kids and women's spaces. The movement's focus on children became its most contentious battleground early on. For many, this wasn't just about respect or inclusion. It felt like an attack on childhood innocence. From explicit materials in schools to controversial medical treatments, activists pushed boundaries that left even moderate supporters questioning their methods. One flashpoint was graphic, sexualized material in children's libraries. When parents objected, they were labeled as bigots or censors themselves, but most people agree with the concept of age-appropriate material for kids. Then came Drag Queen Story Hour that exploded across the country, and drag events billed as inclusive, family-friendly entertainment. But on social media, videos came out showing men in drag gyrating on kids, or family shows where people were singing about eating dicks. Accounts like Libs of TikTok posted over-the-top material every day. And schools didn't just host events, but integrated activism deep in their curriculum. Some districts kept parents in the dark about their kids' gender identity at school, and teachers were trained to affirm any child questioning their gender without telling their parents.
Amber Levine of Newcastle is suing the school. Last December, Levine said she found a chest binder used to flatten someone's breasts in her 13-year-old child's room. Levine says the school either provided it or helped obtain it.
And maybe these people were just having a good time with their chance, but it wasn't funny to a lot of other people. The medical side was even more polarizing. Between 2017 and 21, nearly 18,000 minors in the U.S. started puberty blockers or hormone treatments, and the numbers were rising each year. These drugs, often creating irreversible changes, carried significant risks. Yet they were given to children as young as 10. And by 2021, over 5,700 minors underwent surgeries like double mastectomies to align with their gender identities. Proponents argued these interventions save lives by preventing suicides, but the evidence on that was pretty shaky. Many critics pointed out that mental health conditions like anxiety and depressions often went untreated in favor of rushing into gender transitions. And these excesses didn't alienate just conservatives, but many of the movement's original supporters. And if targeting kids was one misstep, the transgender movement's collision with women's rights was the other. Despite what some activists claim, it's abundantly clear that in any activity that requires strength and speed, men just have a massive advantage over women. I'm not even going to go through those statistics. Leah Thomas was one early example. He was a mediocre male swimmer who, after transitioning, dominated women's competitions. Thomas went from ranking 462nd as a male to breaking women's records and winning NCAA championships.
Here at the end of this race, Thomas starting to pull away.
Female athletes who trained their entire lives suddenly found themselves losing races, scholarships, and opportunities. A recent UN study showed that more than 600 biological female athletes lost over 890 medals to transgendered opponents in 29 different sports. Others suffered injuries competing against biologically stronger opponents. These weren't theoretical concerns. They were happening on tracks and in pools and on playing fields across the world. The problems went beyond competitions. A Vermont high school banned its entire girls' volleyball team from their locker rooms. Their crime? It was objecting to a biological man changing with them. Women's prisons became another flashpoint. Male inmates began declaring themselves transgender, then being sent to female facilities. Some people called that a government-sanctioned rape. In California, a third of the biological men seeking to be housed with women had been convicted of a sex crime. In Wisconsin, it was over half. To many, the pattern became clear. Women's rights, hard-won over decades, were being sacrificed on the altar of gender ideology. Spaces once reserved for biological females, from locker rooms to prison cells, no longer offered protection. All of these overreaches helped combine to fuel a backlash that they'd never seen. It started in Europe, where countries like Sweden, Finland, and the UK changed their policy on medical transitioning. These nations had been early adopter of gender-affirming care, but reversed course after data revealed it was a serious risk to minors. The detransition movement gained steam too. More young people, especially girls, started speaking out about rushing into transitions they later regretted.
I used to believe that I was born in the wrong body, and the adults in my life whom I trusted affirmed my belief, and this caused me lifelong, irreversible harm.
Among those starting hormone treatments, only 64% of biological females continued, and that suggested that many young women might be misidentifying normal teen struggles as gender dysphoria. Public opinion shifted hard as well. By 2024, 55% of Americans believed support for transgender rights had gone too far, including a quarter of Democratic voters. In sports, the numbers were even more dramatic. 69% believe transgender athletes should compete only on teams matching their birth gender. And for the first time ever, it made a difference in political campaigns. In the 2022 election, Republicans had tried to make it an issue, but it fell flat. In 2024, that changed big time. Internal polling showed the transgender issue resonating negatively with voters in key swing states, particularly among Hispanic, Black, and working-class voters, and Republicans bet big on it. During Donald Trump's debate with Kamala Harris, he mentioned that she supported transgender surgeries for inmates. It sounded like something he made up, as he kind of does sometimes, but it turned out he had the receipts, and his campaign put out 2 commercials similar to this one.
Kamala was the first to help pay for a prisoner's sex change.
The power that I had, I used it in a way that was about pushing for the movement, frankly, and the agenda.
Kamala's agenda is they, them, not you.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Research showed those commercials moved voters more than any other in the election, and it was one of the most persuasive ads in years. Republicans spent over $200 million on anti-transgender advertising in 2024, the most ever spent on a social issues ads in a presidential race. Post-election, Democratic politicians began openly criticizing the party's alignment with far-left positions on transgender issues for the first time ever. Massachusetts Congressman Seth Moulton summed it up this way: "I have 2 little girls. I don't want them getting run over on a playing field by a male or formerly male athlete. But as a Democrat, I'm supposed to be afraid to say that. They weren't afraid anymore, and neither are corporations, and that backlash has started there. Companies that had previously embraced anything gender ideology scaled back their messaging after boycotts and public criticism. Hollywood recognized this too, and they're scaling back with transgender topics that they integrated into so many movies. The pendulum is swinging back. Now, that doesn't mean everything will reverse, but the transgender community is on the defense, and it will be for the next few years. You know, another movement that also lost some of its power in the past couple years was the Me Too movement, which took down a whole lot of men. Now, many of them were completely justified, bad guys who abused their power and got what they deserved. But in hindsight, other cases, like the one against Louis C.K., they're not nearly as clear-cut. In fact, you could make a good argument that he was actually a victim of Me Too. I learned a lot in producing that video and looking at the specifics. Hey, thanks for watching. I'm active in the comments below, and if you're not being a jerk, I'd love to chat. And if you enjoyed this, subscribe to see more. Until next time.